One of the biggest issues here is that people don't know that it's happening. It's one of those things that, like, once you know that it's happening, you can't stop seeing it. Like, I've got friends and family now who send me articles every day or every week. Oh, I just saw this about forever chemicals. I just saw that. But if you don't know to look for it, a lot of the time people just see an article and their eyes glaze over and they don't understand it. And so I think just having conversations with people in your life about this problem and educating them, because I think that education is one of the big issues. Because I think for a lot of people, for this issue or a lot of other environmental issues, if they understood the degree of the pollution, they might say, hey, I don't like that, and there might be a push for change. But I think part of the issue is information, and that people really just have no idea about this stuff.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Welcome back to Care More, Be Better. I'm so glad that all of you are here today. To kick off today's show, I've got another big update for you. As of today, our community has helped to plant more than 32,000 trees. This is through our partnership with forestplanet.org. And we're planting one tree for every new subscriber to this podcast, be it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and on our newsletter at caremorebebetter.com. So if you haven't already followed us in these avenues, please do so and spread the word. Today, we're shining light on an invisible but urgent threat that we each face, one that's coursing through the blood of nearly every American. My guest today is Rachel Frazin, energy and environment reporter at The Hill and author of the new book, Poisoning the Well: How Forever Chemicals Contaminated America. Her reporting uncovers the dark story of PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, hidden in everyday products, drinking water, and even our bodies. We'll talk about what PFAS are, how widespread they've become, the human cost, and what we can do to protect ourselves. With that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Rachel to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I want to say first, congratulations on the release of Poisoning the Well. I understand co-authoring such a deep book can be incredibly time-consuming and research, and the wake-up calls you encounter along the way are also quite meaningful. So what first inspired you to undertake this as the focus of your first book?
Well, thank you so much. It has been a journey. I think that just PFAS or forever chemicals, same thing. The more I learn about them, the more I guess fascinated, horrified, frustrated I become, because for my day job at The Hill, I cover energy and environment policy. And one of my first weeks on the beat, the House was voting on a bill called the PFAS Action Act. It did not pass, but it was expected to make some reforms on the issue. And I had never heard of PFAS until that point. So I just started Googling, like, what even are these things and why are they a big deal? And it was the kind of thing that, like, once I was like in the rabbit hole, I could not call myself back out of the rabbit hole, because it was, these things are everywhere. They're in everyone. They are in so many of our everyday products. And I just kept thinking, like, somebody's got to tell people about this, and you can write articles sort of until you're blue in the face. But, I think that having the book really gives us both, one, a resource for people to, help them if they don't know where to start in trying to get information about these things. And two, a platform to talk about this on programs like yours.
Now, I wonder, as somebody who frequently covers energy and environment with The Hill, you've really covered countless stories of environmental harm. What made this particular story stand out as urgent and necessary to expand into a full-length book?
Yeah, so there are a ton of pollutants out there that are causing a ton of damage to our environment and to our health. And so PFAS are not, the only important environmental issue. But I think just sort of the sheer widespreadness of PFAS, the fact that they last a very long time in the environment, that they are mobile, that they are finding them in sort of pristine parts of the environment and remote villages where, there's no history of them being made or used. I think just the sheer, I guess, that they're estimated to be in the bloodstream of at least 97% of Americans. I think just the sheer size of the problem is really what got me to say, and got my co-author Sharon to say, oh my God, this is a massive, massive issue that we think that not enough people know about, that is probably, at least to some degree, impacting just about everybody, even if it's not necessarily impacting all of us equally, and is having really, really horrific impacts in the communities that live downstream from where it's been made and used.
Now, I have heard there's technologies coming out that are supposed to aid in the removal of PFAS from our environments, but I think it's important that we first talk about where they come from, because really, they got their start, in our food sources, and also in things like Scotchgard, right? So we use something to help make a surface more slick so it doesn't stain as easily, or so we can get that fried egg out of the pan really easily. What are other sources of PFAS, and why have they become so prevalent?
So the first PFAS was actually invented by accident by the company DuPont, and it later had a ton of both commercial and military uses. You mentioned the nonstick pans. It was also used in Scotchgard, or stain-resistant sprays. But they're used in so many things today. From heart valves to semiconductors to workout gear to waterproof makeup. These things have really become pervasive. And as I look around, like sometimes I think to myself, do I own anything that doesn't have PFAS in it? And I'm not sure, because except for the items that I've specifically bought because they're PFAS free, they're in furniture and stain resistant carpeting and paper products. Like these things, that they are truly so incredibly difficult to avoid, and they have seeped into so many parts of our lives. But another big historic use and polluter was the U.S. military. These products, they have great properties. These chemicals, they have really, really good properties that make them stain resistant and waterproof, and that makes them useful. And they're also very useful in putting out, or they've been useful in putting out jet fuel based fires. And so because of that, they were used for years by the U.S. military to not only put out fires themselves, but also in training exercises, whereafter they were just sort of washed away and seeped into the ground and sometimes the drinking water sources of nearby communities. They were also dumped into our environment by the commercial users, notably DuPont and 3M have been some of the biggest names on that front, though certainly they're not the only ones. And these things have just sort of spiraled into a really pervasive, massive problem.
Now, in your book, in the first couple of chapters, you really dive deep into that origin story with DuPont and 3M and how they would even be used in things like adhesives. I just would like for you to tell the story of some of the individual activists who learned about the damage that these PFAS were causing and that advocated for their communities, especially as it relates to that DuPont story.
Yeah, so as much as there has been these stories of horrific contamination, there are incredible stories of incredible activists who are doing the work to fight back, to fight for their communities, to fight for water, to fight for, access to healthcare in communities where this is happening. One activist that we spoke to is Brenda Hampton in Alabama. She lives in an area where there's a lot of industrial pollution, including, a historic 3M facility that dumped some of these chemicals into the water. And she has fought and continued to fight, not only for legal settlement with the company, but also to protect her neighbors, to provide them with health care, and to help them, take them to the hospital, provide them with clean drinking water. But this kind of thing is happening all over. You have a similar situation in North Carolina, for example, where you have Emily Donovan, who has really worked to raise awareness in her community and to fight for solutions and to fight for, a drinking water treatment plant from her water utility. You've got Mark Favors in Colorado, who has also, tried to fight the U.S. military and tried to raise awareness in his community about the drinking water problem out there.
Yeah, you need feet on the street that are advocating for this story, because so often companies are trying to minimize the impact because they can also be held economically liable. I have concerns that we have legislation coming through different states around the nation that are essentially barring companies or individuals from being able to sue chemical companies for exposure diseases that they end up having, whether it be from glyphosate or something like PFAS. And these things have ended up in our water table, have a very long half-life. They don't necessarily just go away. And so some of the effects on people's health can be increases in cancer. And I think you even tell that story in this book about how they were noticing that even just inserting a little bit of PFAS into rodents would terminate in a cancer effect every single time, right? So what are we to do as individual citizens when we see things like this happening? Is there something that you think that we can do to ensure that we retain some protections, that we're able to advocate for ourselves and our families and our communities?
So, a piece of the problem, like you mentioned, is that these things are very toxic in really, really tiny amounts. Like there were some studies that didn't even make it into the book where they were giving them to animals and they had to abort the study because all the animals died at any dosage level because, these things are really, really highly toxic. But as far as what people can do, there's a ton. I think that politicians are there to represent you. You are not supposed to be alone. And when you encounter an issue, you're supposed to call your congressman. And, I think that Democrats on the whole tend to be more responsive to environmental issues, but PFAS in some places is breaking through in a really bipartisan way. And you do also have some Republican champions on this one. It's one that divides the party for sure between sort of their more MAHA type of allies and their more, I guess, big business type of allies. But,
Yeah, because they want to deregulate, not regulate. And some of these things deserve really deep laws to ensure that we don't have more contamination happening in our environments, because forever chemicals don't go away. That's exactly their nature, right? They end up in our water tables. They end up in our food sources. They're in mama's breast milk. I mean, babies are getting them too. And that was another thing you covered really early in the book, just the incidence of birth defects, and specifically with relation to the eyes, and I believe also brain, right? So, just it's so impactful to keep the PFAS out of the environment, or at least the incidence of them from increasing, to keep them out of the environment, and then to learn to avoid them however we can. Now, one of the things I'm frustrated by as a mother who cooks at home a lot is the fact that so many of our cooking surfaces use PFAS in order to protect them. In fact, Teflon is in this arena, right? And so many of those other type of, this is, I want to say ceramic, but it's also got a coating on top of that ceramic, which can contain PFAS as well. So what are we to do? Like, how do we find out what our best options are in some of these cases?
And, it varies case by case, state by state, product by product, because like you said, it's in so many things and it can be really difficult and confusing to find out. As far as pans specifically, I've switched to stainless steel. I just would avoid nonstick pans on the whole. There may be one or two out there that have, an alternate formula, but I think I think that stainless steel pans or a cast iron pan works just as well. So I personally have switched over to stainless steel. There are groups that do this kind of work, like Consumer Reports puts out a lot of great reports on PFAS-free products. I've also used their report to find a PFAS-free floss, with sort of PFAS is sometimes used in floss as sort of the thing that makes it glide between your teeth, the thing that makes it easy to use, unfortunately, could have, those sorts of impacts as well, could be one of these toxic forever chemicals. So you have websites like that for your cosmetics. The Environmental Working Group is one that keeps a database of, PFAS-free and other, non-toxic or low-toxic cosmetics. That's another way to get at this. In California, I think they have for some cosmetics that, I forget what the proposition is called, what number, but one of their propositions requires companies to disclose what exactly is in their product. So, but for things like textiles, it can be really, really hard because I don't think there is that same requirement for clothing. So I think for that one, as a consumer, people just kind of have to be aware and note to themselves, all right, well, nonstick or waterproof or stain resistant is a buzzword, or, any sort of combination of those could be water resistant. But if something is advertised that way, or if it's meant to repel water or sweat or stains, that maybe you need to do more research. The good thing is that as companies are advancing and are creating these sort of PFAS-free products, they want to tell you about that, right? Like if you make a sweat-proof product that doesn't have PFAS in it, that should be all over your website. So I'm hopeful that, companies can get that message out there about which products are safe.
Now, my understanding with the PFAS chemicals is that they're so dangerous because they just have a very, very long half-life, which means they don't break down, right? They are chemicals that were created, as you said. It was something that DuPont first created by accident, right? So what exactly are they and what makes them so very dangerous?
So basically, they are a chain of carbon atoms that are connected to like a bunch of fluorine atoms. At their atomic level, it's a chain of carbons that have a bunch of fluorines. And that's what makes them so difficult to break down, is sort of that carbon fluorine bond is a very, very strong one. And that is what keeps them in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years. In our bodies, I think some of them can also persist and build up over time. Others don't. Others do get sort of flushed through our bodies more easily and don't last quite as long, but certainly might be longer than other things in our bodies still. And so that's sort of what they are, is they are these chemicals that are sort of inert, and because of this strong carbon fluorine bond, but because of that, they can last in the environment for a very long time. And so because of that, if a polluter dumped that 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, it's still probably in the river, in the soil, maybe even in the air today. And, the pollution that we're doing today might still be there 50 or 100 or 1,000 years from now if we don't, take this on and try to find ways to clean it up.
Now, let's say somebody's concerned that they may have already consumed quite a bit of PFAS and they're experiencing some health effects that are concerning to them. Is there a way that you've identified where people can utilize a tool to help eliminate the toxin from their systems? Or is this something we're just essentially stuck with?
Yes and no. There are some private companies that will, first of all, do a blood test on you, and you can get the levels of PFAS that are in your body tested. And so if you have reason to believe that, especially if you live near a military base or if you live near, a big industrial facility and you want to know if you have PFAS in your blood, you can get a test. There is some research on ways to expel it. One is actually that they're finding to be kind of promising is donating blood. So when your heart pumps blood, it pumps sort of new, fresh, clean blood. And so if you donate your old blood, unfortunately, that blood is going to somebody else, but at least, that might be a blood donation that they wouldn't have otherwise had.
A life-saving treatment for somebody. When you're talking emergencies, that's kind of important, right?
Exactly. So, obviously, ideally, we would give everybody only clean blood, but I think blood with PFAS is probably better than if you can't access it all. So if you donate blood, that might be one way to get some of this out of your system. But at the same time, I think it's really difficult to sort of flush it all out. That's one thing that can help, that can mitigate it, that, I would recommend people doing if they are concerned or if they want to try and find one way to get rid of this. And the other thing is to try your best to reduce how much exposure you have going forward. And again, there is no one surefire way. You can, again, just try to be more mindful of those products, as I mentioned. You can also look into what is the drinking water situation in your hometown. The EPA has a database, as well as that group I mentioned, the Environmental Working Group, EWG. They have like a tap water toxin database. And so if you look into the situation where you are and you find that you have particularly high levels in your tap water, if you can afford it, you can install, a reverse osmosis system in your house. That can be a little bit of an expensive solution, but if you have the means, and it's also expensive to pay those medical bills on the back end.
Yeah, for certain.
And if not, you can pressure your water provider. I think a lot of times, whether it's a private company, but especially if it's a publicly owned water utility, they might be responsive to that community pushback. So that's another thing that you can do, is you can reach out not only to your national politicians, but also to your local authorities and your local politicians. And if you're in a highly contaminated area, you can demand that they provide you with clean, safe drinking water. And obviously, I can't say that every single one of them is going to respond exactly as you want them to, but it is certainly an avenue.
Certainly, and it would have to start with testing to ensure that they know what's in the water and what health impacts that could have. Now, I know that your reporting uncovered some pretty damning evidence that certain corporations may have known for decades about the dangers of PFAS. I was hoping you could walk us through what you found so that we could utilize this in a way as a backdrop for why it's so important to have regulations.
Right. That's the crazy thing, is that, while this is sort of brand new information to a lot of us, this is not brand new information to the companies or the military who have been putting it into our environment for decades. Dating back to the 1960s, there are DuPont documents that call this stuff toxic or hazardous or warn that it should be handled with extreme care. And they did studies not only in rats, but also in dogs. And they found, damage to those animals' organs. And they said, oh, this also might be useful in detecting damage in people, in our employees who are exposed. By the 70s, 3M was made aware that this was building up not only in their own employees, but also they were presented with evidence that it was building up in the general population, that some scientists at the University of Florida and elsewhere had found fluorine, which is an indicator for PFAS, in the bloodstream of everyday people, of almost everybody that they tested. And then these companies also, by the 70s, were testing their own workers and not only finding, this stuff in their bloodstream, but also finding that some of these people had health impacts, had damage to like their liver function, and were testing funny on some of these liver function tests. And, at one point in the 80s, they did notify the EPA when there was evidence that this stuff could cause birth defects, but ultimately there wasn't action. Nothing was done to actually stop these products from going out on the market. They did very briefly pull women of childbearing age. DuPont and 3M both did off of the lines that were making and were handling these products, but that was very short-lived. And as far as I know, there was no other action done to mitigate that issue.
Well, damage to your essential organs, like your liver, potential for birth defects, including malformation of the eyes. These are pretty important issues, right? Now, I know you focused on 4 contaminated towns in this book. I was hoping you could share one story that has really stuck with you, showing the human impact of PFAS exposure.
Oh man, there are so many.
Certainly.
And pick one. Like, there was a guy in North Carolina who went into the hospital for, another health issue, and they said, "What are you going to do about the mass on your kidney?" And he said, "What mass on my kidney?" And he's okay. He survived. There was another guy who I spoke with in North Carolina who lost his wife. And, he was like, "I'm a soda drinker. I always thought I was going to be the unhealthy one." And she was a water drinker. And, he believes that from drinking all that water, his wife developed health issues that ultimately killed her. And then another one that sort of just tells the sheer quantity of the problem is in a community called Rock Hill, which is sort of an underserved, lower income, historically Black community just outside of Wilmington. They sort of started counting up, they started realizing like, hey, we actually do have a lot of cases of cancer around here. And they live sort of downstream from one of those big polluters. And they started counting up cancer cases. And in their small community, it's really just like 2 streets. It's really not a big area. They found like 130 cases of cancer. It's crazy, just the sheer toll. And obviously it can be hard in some of these communities to pinpoint just one pollution source, and there may be other sources of contamination in some of these areas that we talk to as well, or that we talk about. But certainly these chemicals that the EPA says are linked to cancer are not helping the situation.
Well, and in-home house filters aren't necessarily going to do anything to take out this contaminant. So I know people like myself, as a for instance, we have our fridge filters and our under sink filters. It's not reverse osmosis, but it's we have actually investigated our local water source, looked at what the contaminants are in the water, and mostly in our area, it's really mineral rich water. And with those minerals, some taste is also partaken, and we want to get the chlorine out. We just don't want to drink the chlorine. So we have water filters that specifically aid in getting there, and we don't have a lot of PFAS in our water. It's there in pretty much everything at this point, but the levels from what I can see are much lower than in some other cities that are perhaps really close to an airport or that are next to an industrial testing ground and things along these lines. So I think it's important for people to be aware first. And in the cases in your book, I mean, just that story alone where you said the husband saying, I thought I was going to be the unhealthy one drinking Coke all the time, but he was drinking a bottled product with a safer water that was used to make it. And she was using the water that came out of the tap. So you tell the story in the book where people are often relying on going to one of these clean drinking sites where they can just fill up a 5-gallon jug of water for their drinking water. What other types of remediation are you seeing as working for these people if they know that their water source is contaminated?
So yeah, like you said, most water filtration systems do not filter out PFAS. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, water utilities, if you have a private water utility, are required to regulate certain pollutants. They will be required to regulate certain pollutants, certain PFAS in the future, but not yet. And as of right now, because PFAS are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, it's very possible that neither your water utility nor your at-home filter will filter for them. That being said, there are water filters, both sort of commercially available to regular people and, at the utility level, that can address this problem. One of those technologies is reverse osmosis. Another is granular activated carbon systems, or GAC. There's another third type called ion exchange, and some of those may or may not be better suited to a utility as opposed to a household, or vice versa. I know reverse osmosis is probably the most popular for in-home, but those technologies can make a difference and can help remediate it. But most people don't have that in their house, either because they don't know to get it, or if they do know to get it, they maybe can't afford it. And so it's really, really a big problem. On the environmental contamination side, there are technologies that are coming out that can break these down in the environment. And, at sites where there has to be environmental cleanup, they are finding ways to take them out of the environment. But my understanding is that these technologies are not yet at scale where they can clean up everything. They might be able to take on a particularly contaminated site here or there, but at this point, my knowledge is that it would be really, really difficult to address sort of the baseline contamination that we're all facing. And, you made a really good point where you said, we looked at our water and yes, there is PFAS in there, but it's not at the level of some of these highly contaminated communities. And that's sort of the weird catch-22 that we're in, is that for most people, this stuff might be in your water, but maybe just not to the extent that it is exceedingly high. But even a low level is considered dangerous. The EPA said during the Biden administration there is no safe level of two specific PFAS, PFOA or PFOS. Like, if you have 1 part per trillion, that's not safe. They set a forthcoming legal limit on those two substances, which is 4 parts per trillion, because lower than that it can be difficult to detect even. But some of these communities are facing hundreds or thousands of parts per trillion, and so you might not have it as bad as those guys, and obviously you don't want to. But even if you have 10 parts per trillion or 5 parts per trillion, that's still a level that is considered not safe and possibly having impacts on your health.
Well, endocrine disruption is one thing that comes to mind. That's something that is growing across many communities. Leah Seghetti, who's been on this show before, wrote a book called Green Enough, and she's kind of an activist in this space, right? She specifically is worried about contamination of water tables. And she has gone up against her local water board to try and regulate some of this, or just advocate for creating better systems to have cleaner drinking water for people throughout Southern California, Orange County, things along these lines. And, again, if you're in a developed arena, if you're close to airports, you're more likely to have more of this. But even just washing your clothes that might have Scotch-Brite on them, or a flame retardant or something like that, introduces water into our systems that then have to be cleaned. And are our water cleaning systems doing a good enough job taking care of that? Probably not. And so it just ends up kind of circulating in the system over and over and over again. I wonder what other sorts of health effects you're seeing beyond the really scary cancer, potential for endocrine disruption. Are you seeing relation to things like ADD, ADHD? Is there evidence for that?
I'm not necessarily aware of a link to ADD or ADHD. I have not looked into that specifically, but, as well as, associations with cancer, PFAS as a class are linked to fertility issues. They are linked to weakened immune system and reduced vaccine response. There are PFAS that have been linked to high cholesterol and to obesity and to pregnancy-induced hypertension. And so, there can be a really wide range of impacts. And it's one of those things, though, where some of that research is just emerging because the general population has not been aware of these chemicals, even though the chemical companies have some of their own research that goes back decades. Some of the public research is really just starting.
I'm also thinking about things like BPAs that have been in our systems. Are these in a way related to PFAS?
They're separate. I believe that BPAs are a plastic, right? PFAS,
Hmm.
to my knowledge, are not necessarily plastic. They're sort of separate, but of course, it's all interrelated and interconnected. And I think it's unlikely that there's somebody out there who's suffering from immense PFAS contamination that doesn't have any microplastics in their system, and vice versa. And or who doesn't have, or people who are suffering from microplastics that somehow have managed to avoid all PFAS. That to me sounds unlikely. And I don't know if there's research on whether these things interact. I know that PFAS on their own can occur in mixtures, that you probably are exposed to more than one. And, you may be suffering from impacts of various chemicals all at the same time.
Yeah, certainly. Whew. So they're in everything from our nonstick pans to our waterproof clothing to Scotch Guard to even mascara and other makeup products. So through your findings, what were the primary ways that people were exposed? Was it really just the drinking water?
It really depends on who you're talking about. Some of the people who are facing the worst impacts of this, yes, if you live downstream from some of these polluting facilities, from an airport, from a military site, or in an area where it's been spread as sludge in our agriculture, for a lot of people that is the primary exposure route, if especially the people who live downstream. But that's not necessarily true for everyday Americans. When they were putting together their first PFAS regulations, the EPA was going off of a rough estimate that for Americans, about 20% of our exposure came from PFAS and about 80% came from other sources. It's not entirely clear exactly the breakdown of those other sources, and drinking water is a massive piece of the puzzle. But again, it's in the air, it's in the soil. From the soil, it gets into the food supply. It gets into, our bodies through, exposure to products, especially things that we can ingest. If it's on fast food packaging, and then we eat that fast food, it's possible it leaches, from that packaging into the food, into us, or, from a floss or even a bandage. If we put on a bandage and, that's got PFAS in it, then it might get into our bloodstream off of that bandage. So there are so many different ways that we can be exposed to this stuff.
Well, I don't think I even truly understood how bad this problem was until I encountered your book. And I will just say overall, it made me feel I needed to check in again with my water department here, because the last time I checked all these chemical levels was when we moved into our home in 2009. And a lot can change in 16 years. So the fact of it is that our environment is kind of a moving target, right? You may have operations start that may introduce a chemical or cease that helps to remove it. And I have been approached before on this podcast to interview a gentleman who was creating a technology to help remove PFAS from, in particular, airports, because they had used it so frequently for the potential for fire, just having that flame retardant present to be able to put out fires if they erupt. And I think they also postulated that it was sometimes used in the de-icing of planes, so that they saw more PFAS contamination at airports that had very cold winters. I didn't recall seeing that covered in your book, but I wondered if that had ever come up.
No, I've not heard of this de-icing issue. When you say it, it makes sense, right? Because it's water resistant. Ice is just water, so that seems to make sense. But certainly airports in general, yes, there's findings that areas near airports have excess levels of this stuff in the water and in the soil. For sure, the airports are a big piece of the issue, and it can be scary. I actually, my dad grew up near a civilian airport, so I'm got to be worried about his drinking water. Thankfully, knock on wood, there are no health issues there as far as I'm concerned. But that's the thing, is that these sites are everywhere. How many military bases are there in this country? How many airports are there in this country? Like, it's not just like a 1 or 2 site problem. This stuff it's everywhere.
What do you think the policy solutions or regulatory reforms would be that could make the biggest possible difference?
So that's a great question. So there are now regulations in place that are expected to require some water providers to install PFAS to install technology to filter this stuff out. Under the Biden era rules, what they did was basically they required every public water system to test and say, if you find a significant quantity, or if you find levels of PFOA, PFOS, or 4 other PFAS in your water, by 2029, you are required to install technology. Now, the Trump administration has made some moves that changed that rule. They basically said that now it's only PFOA or PFOS. So if you find just one of those other 4, you don't need this technology anymore. And they gave them 2 extra years. So now it's until 2031. But I do think that, once that takes effect, I guess in 2031, that will be a big deal in getting this stuff out. And a lot of times these PFAS do occur together. So if you have one, you may have more than one. So I do think that's something that is going to make a massive difference. At the same time, companies are still allowed to discharge a lot of this stuff. Maybe not some of those 2 historic PFOA or PFOS, which are some of the biggest legacy PFAS compounds, but other PFAS are still being discharged into our environment. And, a lot of activists say, hey, we need a national rule that turns off the tap that says either you cannot release this stuff into the environment, or you can only release it, in certain areas, in certain quantities, with certain restrictions. And we'll see if the government ever actually gets around to doing that. The Biden administration said they wanted to do it. They didn't. The Trump administration now also says they want to propose some sort of limit. It's not clear what that limit will be or if they will get to it. But, I think something like that is something that may also make a difference. Meanwhile, you've got various states that are putting restrictions on products themselves, saying, hey, if it has these chemicals in it, you cannot sell them here. And that is something that could also, make a difference, especially at the site level. If you've got less demand, if these companies are being forced to change what they're providing to consumers, that could be another driving force.
Yeah. Well, I know in California, we have California Prop 65, but that mostly covers lead and heavy metals. And so I don't know if forever chemicals have been added to what they enforce against, but it would make sense that it be there. So hopefully we'll see a few states lead the charge, because this is just awful to hear about. This isn't unique to PFAS. We've always had issues of pollution going downstream and affecting some communities in a greater and more dire way than other communities. Typically, it affects the disenfranchised and the poor more, right? So, who's living close to airports? Who's living close to dump sites? These are some of the challenges that we face. I would like to see all of it change, but, just getting some protections in place could be ideal. And I do know, too, that, as we start to fire up more coal fire plants can introduce methyl mercury into the air. There is a way to remediate against that, but the Trump administration is also stalling the requirement that that be in place, that remediation effect. Because at the time that they burn the coal, they can actually install a unit that does cost some money to essentially remove the methyl mercury as it's being expelled. And so hopefully, again, we can get some of these things back on track. But I think the important thing is that we talk about it, that we ensure people understand what is happening to their environments, and also have a pathway to ensure that they can help protect themselves and their families. So from what I've gathered thus far, it sounds like we should go to the Environmental Working Group website and perhaps look there as a resource. Connect with our local water boards, especially if we don't have specific filters in our homes, like a reverse osmosis, and I'm forgetting the granular activity C. I didn't know what the C stood for. I didn't get that down. So a GAC filter? Is that
granular
correct?
activated carbon, GAC.
Carbon.
If you Google GAC, you'll be able to find it.
Okay, so one of these tools would help us to ensure that we're not getting more PFAS into our systems, at least through things like drinking water, which we can't avoid, while also not just going out and buying a bunch of plastic bottled water, which could introduce microplastics, which is another problem. So we want to, eliminate problems, not add more. And then also just making sure that we're asking the questions, we're advocating for ourselves, and we're talking to our Congress people. What else might you add to that list?
Yeah, I would say talk to your friends. I think that one of the biggest issues here is that people don't know that it's happening. It's one of those things that, like, once you know that it's happening, you can't stop seeing it. Like, I've got friends and family now who send me articles every day or every week. Oh, I just saw this about forever chemicals. I just saw that. But if you don't know to look for it, a lot of the time people, just see an article and their eyes glaze over and they don't understand it. And so I think just having conversations with people in your life about this problem and educating them, because I think that education is one of the big issues. Because I think for a lot of people, for this issue or a lot of other environmental issues, if they understood the degree of the pollution, they might say, hey, I don't like that, and there might be a push for change. But I think part of the issue is information, and that people really just have no idea about this stuff.
Yeah, that's for certain. Now, I know that covering this story must have been emotionally very heavy, especially as you're talking to individuals who've lost loved ones, who are experiencing health effects, and whose communities have been devastated. How did you balance the need to expose the harm with highlighting resilience and with protecting yourself?
So, as a reporter, I think that my sort of natural inclination is to look for the problems, to look for the sad stories, to look for the people who are being impacted. And I think that the resiliency side and the stories, the incredible stories of people who are fighting back, just sort of come naturally, because I think that once there is a problem and once people know about that problem, oftentimes they want to push back and they want to fight. And I think, there is a massive network of activists out there on this, and a lot of them are very connected to one another as well. And not only, both nationally and locally. Like, again, in North Carolina, one activist, Emily Donovan, I said to her, hey, who else should I talk to here? And she had like a list of like 30 names for me of like more people. So I think that, people who are involved, they're connected both sort of nationally and across communities, but also within the communities. But I think that the resiliency really came from the people that we talked to, and wasn't even necessarily something that I as a reporter looked for, but it was just sort of something that we found naturally.
Well, if there was one thing that you wanted people to take away from reading your book, Poisoning the Well, what would it be?
I think just that this is a massive environmental crisis, right? That this is a problem whose scope is immense, that sometimes, I myself have a hard time wrapping my head around. Like, okay, this is in me and you and everybody else that we know, and it's everywhere, and it lasts a long time, and they move, so they get everywhere. And like, I think just this is a massive environmental crisis. And, I think there are other environmental problems, things like climate change, that people talk about a lot, that you do see on the news, that you do see on TV and articles all the time. And, as a reporter, I'm trying to write articles all the time about PFAS, but I think that just this is an environmental problem that deserves a massive amount of attention and is going to cause a massive amount of problems for us down the road, especially if we don't do anything about it.
Certainly. You've got me thinking about trying to advocate for a reverse osmosis water filtration system at my kids' elementary school. But, with cuts to education as they have been, it's asking for more money is always hard. But now I'm thinking about that too. Okay, if you could sit down face to face with one of the corporate leaders who ignored or who covered up some of the risks of PFAS, what would you say to them?
So I think as a reporter, my inclination with people is not necessarily to have statements, but rather to have questions, to ask why, to ask, what if this was your family? To ask, when did you feel like you knew? Because there was, of course, evidence building up throughout the 60s and the 70s. But I wonder at some of these companies, like, if there was a point when a light bulb went off when somebody said, hey, actually, this stuff is dangerous internally. Like, I wonder if there is, in our research, we found, evidence of them describing these things as toxic. But I wonder if there was one moment or one point or one meeting where they figured it out, or if it was just evidence that sort of built up over time without necessarily getting an aha light bulb moment. And if there is a light bulb moment, what did you do? And if you didn't do anything, why is that? I also think, some of the more recent decision making, I feel, are willing to get a little niche with me. There was one, DuPont eventually spun off its PFAS business to a company called Chemours. And Chemours later sued DuPont and said, hey, you've given us too much of your environmental liability and not enough of your profit lines. And this may have been a sham to get rid of this environmental liability and problem. That suit has gone through various legal processes, and I believe they settled. But one thing in the litigation is they said, hey, DuPont was considering a $60 million investment to prevent the discharges of these chemicals, and they decided not to. They decided not worth it. 60 million bucks, they decided not to do it. And I want to know on that one why. Why not spend that money to prevent these discharges? And frankly, to prevent the potential liability.
Frankly, I have all of the same questions for Monsanto and Bayer, right? It seems like a very similar situation where a company has a bad brand, and this in particular is due to what Monsanto has done with glyphosate's introduction into our environment, using a water-soluble pesticide that gets into the water table and that is hard to eradicate and that affects our wildlife and our butterflies and everything else, right? So, you know what? Bayer buys them and it has a bad brand name, so you kind of bury it, right?
Yeah.
It seems like this sort of pattern will repeat as long as it's allowed. And this is where I think it's critically important that we have better regulation around environmental toxins and pollutants that affect the health of millions and millions of people.
It's really tough. There's a lot of people like yourself who feel that way, and yet here we are.
I don't like that it's politicized. Let me just put it that way. I feel like this is a non-political issue because it does affect everybody. Now, many of our listeners care deeply about both sustainability and social justice. What role do you think we can all play in demanding these stronger protections and better accountability?
So I think that one thing I would ask people, especially on the social justice lens, is I know it can be hard to, again, I've just named 1,000 products. You probably use some of them. You probably use PFAS in your products. And I think from that lens, something that I'm asking myself is not only is this going to impact me and my exposure, but also what about the people who live downstream, right? So on the social justice angle, when you consider your products, when you consider, I guess, voting with your dollars, maybe think about not only your own health, but also the health of people who live near you. And the other thing is, again, this is an issue that can be addressed on a lot of different levels. So you have, not only, the national government and the EPA, you also have your state government and your local government and your water provider and your water utility. And I think just thinking about all the levels on which this can be addressed and whether that's something that you would like to get involved in and you would like to make noise about, because again, not everything has to be writing to the EPA. Of course, you probably can do that too if you want to, send in a public comment on a regulation or something. But there are lots of ways, big and small, national, state, local, for people to get involved in this issue.
Now, what's next for you, both in reporting at The Hill and as an author, a journalist?
So for me at The Hill, I think I'm very focused right now on covering environmental policy in the Trump administration and what they are and are not doing about energy and environment issues at federal agencies as well as in Congress. So I don't know that I necessarily have any major projects going on other than covering news of the day and offshoots that come with it. But if anybody has information or tips or to share, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And that, I think, as far as I'm also just very focused on talking about this book, on talking about the PFAS issue, on continuing to try to bring this issue to light.
Well, I will, of course, include links to where people can find you with show notes. But as a journalist, I'd like to know what platforms you're most active on. Often the answer to that is X. So could you share that?
Yeah, I'm on both X and Blue Sky. I try to post pretty much the same things on both of those platforms. So if you follow me on one, you kind of follow me on both. But whichever is your preference, I'm on both. I do have a professional Instagram. I'm somewhat active on it at Rachel Frazin, but less active certainly than Twitter and Blue Sky, which are my primaries.
Awesome. Now, I will, of course, include links to where people can pick up a copy of your book and encourage them to give it a read. Now, is there anything else that you'd like to share as we prepare to wrap?
No, I think you covered it.
Well, it's an exceptional book. The stories told in it are very compelling. And I appreciate that you've lifted the skirt on this very important and sometimes tragic issue. Thank you so much for this work. I truly appreciate you.
Well, likewise, thank you so much for having me on and giving me this opportunity to try to tell your listeners more about this and to continue to raise awareness about this issue.
Yeah, it has me thinking I need to start a book club related to this podcast and then invite people on for discussion. I think this one could definitely be the seed that starts it all. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think by now each of you understands that I consider this book, Poisoning the Well, to be essential reading for anyone who cares about protecting their health, their family, and their community from the invisible threats that we experience from our environment, like PFAS. It's an example. It's something that you can use as a kind of pathway into understanding how environmental pollutants can affect you and your community. So I really encourage all of you to pick up this book, to give it a read. I have recently started using an app called Speechify to help read some books to me. I love to use Audible too. And I wonder if these tools can help you also get through some of the tougher points that are a little bit harder to absorb because it can be emotional. But I think that's also part of the beauty of a written work like this, to be able to pause and reflect and think about what it might be like to be the person experiencing the ravages that some of these stories that these people experience. They're really real and they're raw, and it's beautifully told. So I encourage you to go out there and pick up a copy of this book. And I am going to send an email to my community about hosting a book club related to this book and some future work that I'm interviewing different authors on. So if you're interested in that, please do subscribe to our newsletter at caremorebebetter.com. If you're already on that list, then we can go ahead and continue that conversation. So again, I'm planting trees for each subscriber to this podcast and also to that newsletter. So you can make the world a little greener by sharing this podcast episode with people in your community that you think need to hear it and encouraging them to also join. Thank you for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can create a better, safer world for all. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.